Thank you very much for this, again, very timely meeting by CLS, an organization I'm very proud to be associated with. It was shocking, absolutely shocking, what happened in Venezuela with the abduction, the military attack and the abduction of President Maduro and his wife. I think we were all expecting some kind of overall massive military attack on the whole country, particularly the capital city, with bombings, in the style of Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, that sort of thing, with cities turned into rubble, which they can still do. Let's not have any illusions about that. I think what that is the first practical manifestation of the new Monroe Doctrine put forward by Donald Trump. It's the very first one, so far. The document was produced in November 2025. And, I think it was there in the plans, but I think they produced it in order to justify what they did in Venezuela a couple of days ago. So what I want to do is I want to go through some of the history of the whole thing with Venezuela. I think you know enough already anyway. And then I want to come at the end to discuss the significance of the National Security Strategy document and the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, as they themselves spelled it out in the document. And then finally, I will concentrate, if I may, on the question of the key questions of campaign points, which we want to do. I understand from information that we have been gathering in the last couple of days that the number of helicopters that participated in the operation was in the region of 50. There were also bombers, B-2 apparently. And we do not know the number of soldiers that actually were involved, but we imagine it must have been in the hundreds. I don't know exactly how many. In the operation, they attacked 4 cities, mainly military installations as well as civilian installations. We have some information regarding the civilian installations, but we do not have too much information about the military installation, but not too much information about the civilian installations. They took the president and his wife, from what I just read a couple of minutes ago, maybe 5 minutes ago, that actually the soldiers were not prepared didn't plan to take Celia Flores, the wife of President Maduro, but she insisted in going with him. And that's why she went. They took him to the Iwo Jima, the USS ship, Iwo Jima, and then from there he was flown into the United States, into New York, which is sort of surprised us at first, but actually I think it makes sense politically, because they moved it to a place where is known as Orange State, which is a very right-wing part of New York State. In Orange State, every time the Trump administration has some problems and engage in some litigation, it tends to go there because the judges there are very friendly to what he wants to do, and usually ends up winning. It doesn't mean to say he can take every case there, but this one I think he was able to. The basic accusation from the General Attorney of the United States, Pam Bondi, is that they're accusing the president and his wife, she is included in the indictment, of drug trafficking and narco-terrorism, plus a string of other, using machine guns, God knows what. That's, I think, the last point is about decoration, but it's essentially drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. And he is being accused before and charged before by the US administration, completely falsely, that he is in charge of a country which is a narco state, which is run by something called Cartel de los Soles, Cartel of the Suns, which does not exist. And as a consequence of that, according to the charge, that position that the Venezuelan government has and the state that he presides, then they're able to actually poison, and this is where the argument about, represents a military or serious threat to the United States. Therefore, the Trump administration can declare war on this, even though it's not legal within the US law itself. They claim they're very exaggerated. They like hyperbole. Certainly Trump does. Hundreds, if not thousands of poison, fentanyl, cocaine, and all the rest of it. So I want to lay to rest this particular part of their argument first, because the whole business began as narco-terrorism and drug trafficking, and then very soon became only the question of oil and regime change. And now that they have President Maduro and his wife captured, then they changed back to drug trafficking and narco-terrorism. The United Nations Office on Drug and Crime, which is the most reliable source of drug crime in the world, it produces reports. I mean, I don't want to bore you with this, but the level of detail of the reports for every single country where there is drug trafficking, drug cultivation, illegal cultivation, transit routes, the type of transit route, the method of transport, and so on, is extremely detailed. So incredibly detailed that when you read it, you are very surprised, as to how much these people know. The reports every year annually produces maps, trade routes, there are proportions of drugs that is shipped to every single country, the proportion of drugs of various kinds which are produced in every country every year, and they give you a sense of the evolution of it. They give you a sort of graph with, 2000, 2001, 2002, and so forth. They're the most reliable one because they're not political. That is to say, they're a technical body of the United Nations that want to really combat, produce information which is reliable, so the law enforcement authorities of various countries can actually operate with very reliable information. So in that sense, the Drug Enforcement Administration, which is the other source, is totally unreliable because it's very political. I will share the report and everything else when I can. So that's number one. They say the following, and they've been saying this for years. This is not only the last report. These have been, several consecutive years. I think it's more than 10 years. There are no illegal cultivations in Venezuela, none. This has been eradicated by Hugo Chavez and then continued with President Maduro. The second point they make is that between 87 to 92% of the cocaine that is produced in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, and sometimes they include part of Bolivia, gets to the United States through the Pacific. Venezuela has no coastline in the Pacific. But then the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime continues to say something between 5 to 7%. And these figures change from year to year, 6 to 8, 4 to 6, that sort of thing. Tries to get through the Caribbean via Venezuela. So they make the point that Venezuela is at worst a transit point and is totally insignificant. Even more important than that, they say that Venezuela's contribution to the fentanyl is zero. Let me repeat, zero. All of that is down to Mexico and others. So that's the first thing. So the charges are completely false. And in the investigations carried out by this very reliable, very detailed, very thorough investigative body, which is very, very prestigious, it doesn't mention in year after year after year, never once mention the Cartel de los Soles. It mentions all the other cartels, never that one. So that's the key point to actually make, because the media, I've been doing some interviews here and there and so on, as you do sometimes when crises like this happen. And the narrative of the broadcaster is just unbelievably either ignorant or deliberately, mischievous, because they keep saying Venezuela's contribution to drug trafficking is so important and so on, and therefore there are good reasons as to why some countries have to react. That's the kind of argument. I keep telling them every time, this is the position. So anyway, that's the first one. The second one is that the shock comes because the United States actually has done it openly, this particular abduction and attack on a country. In the past, and that was a point that in the morning in the Crispin Flintoff show, Mark Kennard made very poignantly. He said, normally they do this, they've done this before, they kidnap the president of Haiti, they send it to Africa, they kidnap the president of Panama, and then they send it to the United States, to prison and so on. So they've done this before, but in the past, they actually made sure that they discuss it with arguments such as human rights, democracy, and so on. On this occasion, Donald Trump had no bones about saying that it was all about oil. He wants to have the oil. And this is what he said. And there is this long history of interventionism by the United States in its backyard. I think I want to make one point about these very blatant recognition by Trump and company as to the way they have done it. My sense, and this actually is reflected in the National Security Strategy document, my sense is that the United States, at least this current within the US elite, has drawn the conclusion that, the only way they are going to maintain the very precarious supremacy, if at all, that they have in the world, which is being challenged quite dramatically everywhere, is only by military means and force. That is the conclusion. So therefore, why complicate things? Why have to get into discussions? And the reason for this is the following, technically in terms of US politics. If you actually have arguments that are legal, then you need to go to Congress. And if you go to Congress, Congress will try to modify things, complicate your life, say no, and so on, as happens with every administration in the past that intervened in many countries. Well, on this occasion, what Trump is doing is through executive order and directed by himself, which tells the Department of Justice and the Pentagon what to do what they want. So this is quite an important dimension to understand. And the reason for this brazenness, I think that's a word in English, for this brazenness is the fact that they know they're in severe decline and they don't care anymore about what anybody thinks because they have the military might to get their way. That's as far as that's as far as I understand it. I think we're going to have to, let me put it in vertical, we're going to have to get used to this. So that's the first quite important point. The second thing is, there is a history of it, is the brutal violence, which is really horrific. From 1973, when they overthrew the Allende government in my country, in Chile, in 73, in 17 years, the military dictatorship of Pinochet, which was installed by the United States, or with the support of them, they assassinated 5,000 people, I think less than 5,000, about 4,000 something. Whereas in Argentina, because of the same reason, the United States was behind the military junta there and the operation to clean out the country of rebels, left-wingers, and so on. in 6 years, between 1976, when the coup took place, and 1983, when the Falklands War stopped them, they assassinated 32,000 people. And this was with the consent and encouragement of people like Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon and the State Department. They were the ones who actually were indicating exactly what, even worse, at the time, in the Southern Cone, Kissinger and Nixon set up something called Operation Condor. Condor is the typical bird of the Andes, which is a beautiful animal. And at the time, Operation Condor was to make sure that all these intelligence services and security services and the state apparatus and military of the Southern Cone dictatorship, there were plenty of them at the time, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, and so on, should coordinate their efforts to ensure that they're actually engaged in a witch hunt to eliminate physically all the rebels that were in that region, which was one of the most radical ones of the whole place at that time. In Nicaragua, because they made the revolution between 1979 and 1990, when they finally were defeated because of US military intervention by proxy financing the Contras in a war that cost the country 50,000 people, which was horrific. And the main people who died were killed, assassinated by the Contras, armed, trained, financed by the United States, was actually teachers, people who engaged in literacy, agronomies that went to teach the peasants what to do, and so forth. They killed as many as possible, particularly women, which they did horrible things to them, 50,000. So that gives you an idea how far they were prepared to go at the time. In El Salvador, when the guerrillas were able to control something like a third of the country as part of their rebellion against another dictatorship, was exactly the same. They assassinated 80,000 people, and in Guatemala next door, 120,000. So the point I'm trying to make with this is, if they succeed in what they want to do, which is in the National Security Strategy document, what they're going to do, God knows what. I mean, is really, really bad. So let me come back to the question of the National Security Strategy. It's a very simple document. I'll put it in the chat if I can. Let me just find it. Yeah, this is the one. Here we are. Give me 1 second. We have the responsibility to be well informed. So the National Security Strategy is about a sort of updating. This is what they mean by that. They sort of it's an updated on the Monroe Doctrine, which they label the Trump corollary. To understand what corollary means in terms of the United States, the Monroe Doctrine was espoused by President James Monroe in 1823 on the 2nd of December, actually, 1823, to the full Congress, to the Congress and the Senate in the United States, which is the normal State of the Union kind of thing the presidents do in the United States. And it's very interesting and peculiar at the same time, if I may go into a little bit of history. The speech by Monroe, excuse the familiarity there, the speech by Monroe at the time, on the 2nd of December 1823, it lasted something like an hour and a half. And the Monroe Doctrine, part of it is 5 minutes of the speech. It's a very short thing. I don't know, but I imagine, because I used to teach this stuff in my university and so on, and people get conferences. People used to think this is a treaty, a document which is very well formulated with a lot of detail. No, it's very little detail. And we have to understand, in 1823, what was going on was the war of liberation by Latin American nations to get independence from Spain against colonialism. So the United States was extremely worried that if Spain were to be supported by the French and by the perfidious British, they would come in and maybe threaten the United States independence itself. 1823 was about, what, 30, 40, 50 years after the independence of the United States. So things were still very fresh and they were not as powerful as they were before. So they began to apply that policy very cleverly, the Monroe Doctrine, in Latin America by excluding the Europeans from influence of any kind whatsoever in the region in Latin America. And at the time, the slogan was, which was correct at the time, it fitted the objective situation, which was America for the Americans, which did not mean what people understand it for by today, which was America was not for the United States, because Americans were everybody that was in the Americas, all the way from the United States all the way down to Patagonia. Later on, and very soon later on, this began to become, the mechanism by which the United States began to intervene directly and rob territory after territory towards the West and towards the South. They eliminated the indigenous population all the way to California and then went south against Mexico, and they took in 2 wars. I don't have time to go into more details. In 2 wars, they took 55% of the original territory of Mexico. Then they intervened in the Caribbean, which was the absolutely preferred area of intervention because of the significance, geopolitically speaking, at the time where there were no planes. There were only ships and navigation. So therefore, whoever controlled the Caribbean was able to control everything else in the region. And that's why the Caribbean is the most intervened, from a colonial point of view, region in the Americas. Because the Danish, the French, the English, everybody went there. Even the Germans at some point had a go. So that gives you an idea. But the United States used that, but then by the time when it controlled the region, and it had, serious economic, political, and military control, because the United States developed extremely quickly, they began to use what is known as the Roosevelt corollary. President Theodore Roosevelt began to apply gunboat diplomacy. And every time a country in the Caribbean misbehaved, I'm using that with inverted commas, he used the military to intervene. And he said, you have to speak very softly when it comes to foreign policy and carry a big stick. So that's why Trump is calling the updating of the Monroe Doctrine the Trump corollary, because he intends to do what Roosevelt did in the 1920s, 1910, 1920s, up to 1930s, and he intends to do it now. So that's another important dimension to understand why he calls it. And he says the following, I'll quote a paragraph, if I may, on page 5. It says this: we want to ensure that the Western Hemisphere, that is to say all of the Americas, remains reasonably stable and well-governed, enough to prevent and discourage mass migration to the US. We want an hemisphere whose governments cooperate with us, the United States, against narco-terrorists, cartels, and other transnational criminal organizations. We want an hemisphere that remains free of hostile foreign incursion or ownership of key assets, and that supports critical supply chains. And we want to ensure our continued access to key strategic locations. In other words, and they complete the paragraph with this phrase, we will assert and enforce a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It couldn't be clearer. It's totally transparent. That is to say, and this is important because this fits with a huge amount of reports that I've been reading over the years involving this business, of report by the Southern Command to the Senate Armed Forces Committee. This is a very important committee because it determines the amount of monies and the amount of expansion that the military budget is going to have, according to their reports in the hemisphere as well as elsewhere. So whoever happens to be the commander-in-chief in the Southern Command, which is, takes care of not Mexico, but from Mexico all the way down, gives a report to say what the problems are in the region. Normally it was communism in the past. There is communism here, there are communist possibilities over there, communist tendencies, communist threats somewhere else. But that came to an end when the Soviet Union disappeared. So they invented the war on drugs, which, worked for a while to a point, and then I remember we had Panama in 1989, which was the highlight or the height of that policy. But then they began to say there are the following problems, which are the main threats to the security, the national security of the United States, is the actual alliance and the actual collaboration between radical populists and narco-terrorists. What they meant at the time when they first used these phrases, I remember I was shocked when I read it the first time. These documents are quite long. So, you have to have a nerd like me to go through every page. But the basic position was radical populists. At some point, they even included Lula from Brazil. And narco-terrorists will be organizations such as the FARC in Colombia. And they said that these two combine, on the one hand, politically, to undermine the position of the United States and their allies, and the narco-terrorists will use military weapons. They will use weapons, military means, as well as trafficking in drugs. And this combination, they began to decorate more and more and more as more reports were being given to the Senate Armed Services Committee, which I remember reading again and again, and it was getting worse and worse every year. And then they began to add, they said there was a massive, they really exaggerate, massive influx of people from the Arab countries. And they were concentrated in what is known as the three-national border, which is Brazil, Paraguay, and Bolivia. That's where the Arabs were. And these will be people from Hezbollah, the PLO, and any organization that they wanted to actually use as demonization in association with the left in Latin America. So this has been evolving, this policy from the Southern Command has been evolving towards the latest reports in the last 4 or 5 years, perhaps even longer. They've been saying that now the problem is mainly external competitors that are authoritarian regimes that are using authoritarian regimes outside the hemisphere. I'll give you the names in a minute, who are coming together with authoritarian regimes in the hemisphere itself that actually coalesce together, not coalesce together, but collaborate together in order to actually take control over key resources of the region, which intends to weaken and massively deteriorate the position of the United States in the hemisphere. And they mean by that primarily China, but also Russia. And the reason is China has been investing very heavily in raw materials in Latin America in a very convenient fashion. In fact, if you look at the pink tide that took place from 1999 to 2000, when Chavez was elected, all the way to 2016, when Dilma Rousseff, the president of Brazil, was impeached, which is when that pink tide stopped, Latin America never had it so good. Poverty declined from 48% to 23%. They nationalized every imaginable thing that they could. You went to the newspaper, they nationalized something. Every day, every week. They expelled, ambassadors from the United States. They expelled the CIA from countries. They expelled, all their military presence in many countries, certainly Bolivia, one of the best ones in this regard, but not exclusively. Chavez left no US presence in Venezuela, which was very heavy. And then Correa insisted in ensuring that the lease for the US military base in Manta in Ecuador was not renewed. He was subjected to incredible pressure to ensure that he did. The military bases are there ostensibly to fight against drug trafficking, but it's a lie. It's just military control, as we know. And on one occasion, I remember, if I may tell you anecdotally, Correa said that, whether he was interviewed, he said, have they put pressure on you? Any imaginable one, he said, but, I said no. They said, but have they make you an interesting offer? He said, yes, they have. So on one occasion, they made me an interesting offer, and it was the following. He said, what would it take for you to accept that we renew the license of the Manta military base? Correa said, there is only one condition on which we shall accept. The young thought that he was thinking money. No, he said, we will continue the license of your military base in Manta if we, Ecuador, are entitled to have a military base in the United States, and we would like to have it in Florida. And, that was the end of the conversation. So the assertion of sovereignty, in that decade was unbelievable. It showed what could be done. Indigenous people became protagonists of their own destiny. Languages were recognized. Things were, I can wax lyrical about this. I don't want to because of time. So this is what we were trying to stop. And what made it possible was the fact that these raw materials could not only be used, the revenue of them not only could be used in the people, to benefit the people, but because they had a partner somewhere else, which was China, that was prepared to engage with them in a fair trade, where there was the win-win concept. Everybody wins. And that's why things went so good. The complication was that raw material commodity selling to China, which was extremely good because, it produced a lot of revenue for our countries in Latin America, was not transformative in the sense that we continued depending very heavily on the exportation of raw materials. So when there was the credit crunch, things went down quite dramatically, and the United States took immediate advantage of that. So that's what I mean by, the Southern Command suddenly ensuring that this. So now what we have is you have a situation where the reality of the political situation in Latin America is this. There is no, certainly this applies to the Caribbean more than any other place. There is no government which is safe at all. What they have done to Venezuela, it can be done to anybody in the region. And certainly the smaller you are, even if you're an island, which is much worse, it is easier for them to actually increase and put pressure on you by surrounding you with a naval blockade, by applying sanctions against you, and by going in easily, and then, take your leaders away and accuse them of God knows what, whatever it is they want to do. So it's the policy of a bully. That's what is going on. That's really what is going on right now. So the shock that the abduction and the military attack and the abduction of President Maduro and Celia Flores, it was so incredible. I mean, I've been following, I've been getting information. There have been demonstrations absolutely everywhere in the world. Huge number of one. In Italy, more than 6, Rome, Milano, and so on. In Spain, Madrid, Barcelona, Andalusia, all the rest of it. In Belgium, everywhere. In San Francisco, in Times Square, in New York. Even the reaction international has been, at the level of the masses, the level of organization has been extraordinarily large, very, very large indeed. And one interesting one has been the reaction by many governments in the world to say they condemn this. So that's the first part I want to concentrate on it. But I want to highlight particularly the reaction by China. It's a very heavy player, quite weighty in the international situation. And normally the Chinese foreign policy pronouncements are quite gentle. very mild, very careful. It looks like, somebody who belongs to a very moderate party. That's my impression. Not even a liberal, perhaps even less than that sometimes. But on this occasion, the Global Times, which is one of the newspapers produced by China, had the following headline in one of the key articles. You open the front page in the digital version of it, and you get immediately this title, which is China calls on US to release President Nicolas Maduro and his wife at once. That's a statement from the foreign ministry. I've never expected to be so sharp. Nobody said, well, it's better to negotiate and so on. So it seems to me that is going to be very likely, we do not know at this stage yet, is going to be very likely a point of campaign which is going to be very important because there is no justification, there is no evidence that the United States, Attorney General has on these two regarding drug trafficking because of the information I gave you at the beginning from the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime. And then just one key paragraph in the article by the Global Times from the Foreign Ministry says China calls on the US to ensure the personal safety of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, release them at once to stop toppling the government of Venezuela and resolve issues through dialogue and negotiation. Bang. So many other countries are going to join this call. This is going to take place in international bodies, the United Nations, and so on. However, the story of the abduction and everything else does not end there because Donald Trump organized a circus, dressed Maduro with pajamas. He was blindfolded with glasses that make it look cool, very dark, and with chains, in a picture next to his press conference as an image, not the actual person. And at the press conference, he touched several things. He said, as far as the United States is concerned, not necessarily in that order himself, he said, the oil in Venezuela belongs to the United States, which is not the same. We won the oil by controlling the government and controlling the country. No, he said the oil belongs to the United States because it was the US who built the oil industry in Venezuela. Since we built it, we owned it. And what they've been doing, Maduro and company, and Chavez, of course, they have been stealing our oil from us. I couldn't believe it. It was just totally blatant, made it bang. Straight to the face, as it were. Just brazen, total thief, on your face. So that was number one. Number two, he said, we are going to be running Venezuela from here. And we're going to tell them what to do, or else there would be more of this, that is to say, the military action and the abduction of the president and the wife. He said, and next time it's going to be bigger. It's going to be wider, it's going to be more intense. So then he said, if they don't, then we're going to start abducting them all. And in other words, we will continue this until we get totally to a transition where we have a government which is ours. He didn't say ours, but that's what he meant. So what it means, could be a sort of model. You surround the country with sanctions, you organize a military fleet that goes around there, threaten them and so on. At some point, you take the leaders out, and then you begin to put pressure to force a transition, seeking to split the leadership and so on and so forth. You can imagine what it means. So this bully, who is wounded and is declining quite dramatically, is prepared to go for this kind of thing. Now, the significance for Venezuela on this is this. They're going to be under military pressure again and again and again all the way through, possibly starting from next week, starting from tomorrow. Not that I'm informed or I'm aware of some previous information which I don't have. I think that's the logic of the situation. That's what I'm trying to say. It might not happen, might not. In Venezuela itself, the Council of State, which is the formal body which involves governors, the Minister of Defense, the Vice President, key ministers, and so on, met and took a decision through the Supreme Court, which produced a document of 3 pages, saying that given the circumstances, the Vice President, which is next in line, is going to take charge of the presidency as an interim president. The term in Spanish is presidente encargado, which means president in charge. It's because of the peculiar circumstances. I don't know exactly what it means, but I want to explore briefly what it might mean. The document from the Supreme Court is quite legalese. It's sort of a lot of legal jargon, which is not, I'm not sure of the significance of every single terminology or phrase is there. But my sense is this, as a lay person, given the extraordinary circumstances and Vice President, now President in charge, Delcy Rodriguez, who was a woman, made it very clear in the speech she made to the nation. He said, these are extraordinary circumstances. The president of Venezuela is President Nicolás Maduro. Only him is the president. But so as long as this is not returned to us, I'm in charge. In other words, they don't have to do anything until it's returned, which means, opposition are going to demand elections which will be controlled internationally, God knows what. Very likely that is going to happen as well, that pressure. So, interestingly, the state apparatus, the state built by Hugo Chavez and President Maduro is intact. It's entirely there. There is no disarticulation at all. And they send a message to the population to stay calm, to regroup and to organize in order to organize the resistance, which is going to come because they know more pressure is coming from the United States. And many of the pundits discussing in right-wing outfits in the United States, such as CBS, not MSNBC, which is now MS Now, but CBS, or Fox, and certainly CNN, which I follow daily. The discussion there is more or less, it's not easy to just go in Venezuela and take over because there will be resistance. The military are not sure that they just can go in and take it over, despite the fact that they've taken away the president, because there will be resistance now. Interesting, the press conference, President Trump was asked about Maria Corina Machado. And he said, not her, whether she was going to the president be installed by the US. And he said, no her, which, I was taken by surprise. And he said the following, he said, no her because the people in Venezuela doesn't not like her. People in Venezuela do not like her. She doesn't have support, which is true. So that's an interesting going. So God knows what else they have in mind. This might not mean something good. It might mean something worse. I do not know, but I know that I have the responsibility to ensure the tell So this is the significance for Venezuela. And this success, with inverted commas so far, might whet their appetite to go for something else. In the press conference, the person was next to Trump. There were a few others. It was also Marco Rubio, the state secretary, who is the architect of what is being done. And Marco Rubio was asked by Trump to speak at the press conference. And the main thing he said was, Cuba should be extremely concerned. In my sense, there are 2 possible targets that, they might go for if they do. Because it depends on the international reaction, the opposition that it meets and so on, which I'll come back to in a second. I think Colombia looks like an easier one than Cuba. But I do not know whether they're going to go for one or the other or for the 2 of them at the same time. So if the success whether their appetite, they're going to go for one of them and see whether they can do the same. Remember, in the case of Colombia, they have 14 military bases already, maybe more. In Cuba, they have the Guantanamo Bay naval base, and the Cuba is surrounded anyway by all the military apparatus all around the Caribbean, Florida, and so on. So Cuba is already surrounded somehow. You can imagine the rest of the Cubans are extremely concerned. And then this means the significance, as I said already, for the Caribbean and for Latin America and for the rest of the world. He's been threatened Canada with making it the 51st state of the United States. He's been threatened with taking Greenland, by military force. And to take in Greenland, where there are about 70,000 people, that's the population, that would be a piece of cake. And I don't imagine Denmark being in a position to actually come to the rescue militarily and so on. So we'll see how far it goes. And I want to finish with this. I know it's very long. I'm sorry.
Yes. Thanks. Come on.
So I think we need to campaign on the following. We unequivocally condemn the military attack, the deployment of the fleet, and the abduction of President Maduro and his wife. We demand that the UK government unequivocally condemn the military attack and abduction of the president and his wife. We should remind the Prime Minister that he has the constitutional and moral responsibility of upholding international law. That's his role. So we need to insist that and remind you of that. We demand the immediate and conditional and safe return to Venezuela of President Maduro and his wife. Please read the document of U.S. National Security Strategy. It's an important point. And attend today's rally online, which is at 6 p.m. later on, and attend the picket opposite Downing Street tomorrow at 5 p.m., which is going to take place at 5 p.m., outside Downing Street. Sorry about the length, but I thought I wanted to be comprehensive, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Such a comprehensive sweep of the Caribbean and not only the Caribbean, the whole region, but a historical background to that nasty document, the Monroe Document. Clearly looking to recolonize us again, and in some cases I've mentioned before that if possible, re-enslave some of us in the Caribbean. And we can't put it past this racist orange man in the White House for even thinking about it. I've mentioned before, he could not see a genocide in Gaza, but for a few hundred, maybe white farmers killed in South Africa, he's declared a genocide and have given them a free pass to enter into the United States.
What happened to Luke?
Luke has disappeared.
I've seen. Can I do this? I see Joseph. Joseph.
Yes, Francisco. Thank you again. Once again, you always bring a fresh air for us and always give us hope by your delivery. Just a provocative question, though. In terms of the Caribbean, CARICOM, some people have criticized CARICOM for being weak, that they could have responded differently, that they could have taken the issues to the United Nations as a group, and they have not. And it seems that all the Caribbean islands are individually trying to work out their own salvation under this.
Can I stop you there a minute, Joseph? Yeah. I'm not sure why I got cut off there again, but you'll come back with your question. I was just trying to wrap up ready on Francisco's talk and to put a question to him. And one of the questions that was in the notice. So we'll come back to that one in a minute. I didn't get to hear your question because
I think it's the CIA.
Yeah, probably. They visited last meeting as well, so we'll see. But I'll ask the question. You'll get a chance to put your question again, Joseph. Now, I wanted to ask what was the kind of response, or how you see the response from the CARICOM governments in the region? How you felt that, Francisco?
Yeah, I think it's been quite careful, but it has been. That is to say, they do not agree with it. And I think it makes sense because it's a matter of self-survival. If they were to support it, there is no reason for them not to be invaded militarily in a friendly manner by the United States and take over. They have resources and they essentially the islands become unsinkable with aircraft carriers, and the United States want to expand its military position in the region. So um, I've seen also the response from the Grenadian government, which has been quite decent. But I understand totally why it's been so careful, because they're in a very vulnerable position. Who could have imagined that they were going to attack the strongest one in resources and military, which is Venezuela, in this fashion? So I don't think we should criticize him only when he's due, such as perhaps Trinidad and Tobago. I hope I'm not crossing any line there. But otherwise, it's understandable that countries are careful.
Okay, and the question that was in the chat was from Shahida Udin, who asks, "How do we counter this colonial attack by the USA and its proxy?"
Well, I think they came to the conclusion that trying to play with democracy, and continue with that. Remember, they have to sort of get rid of Pinochet, politically, that is, because it became untenable. The masses were in the streets organizing protest after protest, and Pinochet became a difficulty. So they got rid of him through a referendum, which was organized by the United States and the opposition there. And eventually, we defeated Pinochet and we brought democracy back in, which is not perfect. So there were several experiences like that in many places. Fujimori in Peru, the same story, very authoritarian, really brutal. 60,000 people dead in 10 years. Fighting against terrorism, so-called, and then, introduce a new, very authoritarian constitution. And the United States intervened to get rid of it because it became a problem because of the possibility of, mass reaction. On this occasion, on this particular wave of the United States and Trump, I think he wants the worst to be the allies of him, such as Milei, such as Jose Antonio Cast, such as perhaps, Tuto Quiroga in Bolivia. The worst of the worst, the most extreme, because he's trying to build a sort of Latin American and international current of extreme right-wing currents run from Washington, run by him. And so therefore, what there is going to be in Latin America, if they get away with it, which in some cases they are, is going to be massive, brutal austerity with huge amount of repression and the militarization of the country by the United States, such as Argentina, such as Ecuador, and so on. And, there is not going to be middle ground. In that sense, that strengthens the left, but it makes the fight more brutal. We'll see how it goes.
Thank you. People are asking about a recording. We usually send out a recording once you've registered for this meeting, so it will come to you. Joseph, would you like to come in with your question?
Yeah, well, I was asking the question that you asked about the CARICOM response, I was saying that, people had said, well, CARICOM had been weak and they should have taken the issue very early on at the United Nations for discussion and so on, so that we could have helped to insulate them. But of course, Francisco responded, which I wouldn't go to. The question I would ask him now is that, in terms of the solidarity of people throughout the region, I know the world has been very, very encouraging, but in terms of the Americas, what do you think could happen in the next few weeks and days? I would say something. There was a speech by a someone in the U.S. of Grenadian descent. He been elected to a position in New York. And something he said, he invoked the spirit of Morris Bishop. And I sent it to my Latin friends, colleagues, and they respond, we are so inspired by the words as echoed by the guy that Maurice had said. only to be greeted a few hours later with the invasion. What do you think about the possibility of the region building a strength of resistance, notwithstanding the language and the geography? Thank you.
Sure. There is substantial opposition in the US itself. I don't mean in the masses. There is opposition in the masses, but there is substantial opposition at the level of the establishment. The Democrats are 100% fully against, which means, hundreds of members of Congress, and there will be 40 plus members of the Senate. The Senate is only 100. So that's one thing. But interestingly, they've been joined on several occasions in opposition to the war on Venezuela by Republicans. Several Republicans are already very, very militant, and they're thinking of putting forward a resolution or a motion to the Congress, which, if voted for, it will take away the president's temporary powers of waging war against anybody, which will really paralyze it. More interestingly, there is opposition to his own attempt, Trump's own attempt, to militarize, democratic cities, particularly Chicago, Los Angeles, and so forth. And this opposition is coming from the judges at the federal level, but also including the extreme right-wing Supreme Court. So he was forced to retreat on this. In other words, they don't want militarization. And this shocked, as produced, reaction from Kamala Harris, Jack Schumer, Rand Paul, which is Republican, and so on. And they're absolutely outraged. They're absolutely shocked that they cannot believe. And there are several reasons, that crisscross in all of these universe of politics in the United States. One of them are extremely worried about the damage it's going to do to the prestige of the United States International, which is obviously going to be immense. If you listen to Pedro Sanchez in Spain, he considering discussing, what the hell are we doing in NATO? And we are not going to go increase the military expenditure as the United States requested to 5.1% of the GDP. No way, and so on. And there is plenty of, dissent in the European Union, but also internally. The person that Joseph referred to is Soran Mamdani, who has just been elected mayor of New York City. He's a Muslim, he's a Democrat socialist, he's quite radical. And he's reported by himself that he called President Trump and told him that he totally disagreed with this thing he's done in New York. So the more this grows, including China and many others, the more difficult it's going to be for the United States to do something. So in terms of answering with this long preface to Joseph's question, it will depend very much on the level of opposition that is actually mastered in all of this context. And that will determine whether he goes for it or whether he does something else. Because there is an inter-government which is interim in Venezuela, and they're prepared to continue fighting. To do another one of them is going to possibly tilt the balance against Trump in the Congress, which will be interesting. And Congress in the United States returns tomorrow. So, before they were on holidays, now they will be active, and so things can happen. We'll see what goes on.
Thanks. I've got two questions. We'll take those two together, Francisco, and then we'll see if there's any more question. I'm only seeing two hands. Maybe people will alert me if there's any more going on. Okay, we've got Stephen and then Ian Drummond. Stephen, you want to put your question? Comment? Are you there, Stephen? You need to unmute. Okay, we'll go to Ian and we'll...
Yeah, I'm having some problems unmuting. That's why. Greetings, everyone. Happy New Year. Fantastic presentation, my brother. Two questions, quick. Seeing that places like China, India, the Caribbean, and other nations are depending on Venezuelan oil, which to my understanding is not using American currency to purchase the oil, how does that basically put the U.S. in a domineering role to control the world's largest natural gas resources? And the second part is, if nothing is done about what happened, how does this impact regions like the Sahel Group, which was whereby they actually did a bombing in northern Nigeria, and the Sahel Group basically surrounds Nigeria? What kind of strategic location would that place America in to stop this revolution that's going on in the Sahel region? Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Ian, you want to come in with your question now, and then Francisco, you take two, yes?
Thank you. Just a quick question about what's next and who's in charge of Venezuela right now. Because it seems to me it's the Maduro government are still in power in Venezuela, minus Maduro, who they still recognize as the legal president, but kidnapped. Delcy Rodriguez as the interim president, I think, still recognizes him. And they're talking about resistance and so on. But meanwhile, Trump comes out, apologies, Trump comes out and talks about her basically being his chosen puppet. So I'm just wondering if this is simply more lies and even delusions from an unstable president, and if that will soon blow up in his face and come back to haunt him. It's also very interesting how he's shoved the Venezuelan opposition aside after all that they've been campaigning for decades has finally happened. But he's saying they're not popular and so on. And maybe he has access to the CIA intelligence that suggests that a lot of that propaganda about how popular they were, how they really won the election, was itself lies, and he's stupid enough to share it with the rest of us. Or it might even be as petty as sour grapes from the loser of the Nobel Prize towards the winner. I don't know. But either way, it's interesting that he's sidelining them, and that's getting criticised by some of his natural neocon supporters of this kind of a move. And when he's talking about privatising the oil, that was nationalised in '76, well before Chavez. And even John Bolton, I heard on the radio, saying it was unrealistic to try and turn that back. So when you've got John Bolton saying you're too bellicose, you know you're in trouble. So what are the chances of this blowing up in Trump's face and still becoming a Bay of Pigs debacle rather than a regime change? And even given that, what then happens to Nicolas Maduro as the still recognized president in Venezuela? I think there'll have to be a big defense campaign to get him out of jail, like with Mandela or Marwan Barghouti.
Thank you. Okay, do you want to take those two, Francisco?
Yeah,
There's
I
a few
will.
more there.
I'll take the last one first and then Joseph Stevens. The new government is Delcy Rodriguez because he's the second in line constitutionally, is the vice president. He's in charge. The Council of State has confirmed this. The Supreme Court has confirmed this. There's no split as far as we know today of the armed forces, the political leadership, the Socialist Party, United Venezuela are all together. And interesting, it's been recognized immediately by President Lula. It's been recognized immediately by Mexico. And I think others will follow, and many others, I suppose, China and so on. So the existing government has control over the state and the armed forces, which is the crucial thing, and has territorial control as well, which is the crucial consideration. And it is recognized internationally as the one that is in charge because of the Constitution. That's clear. When it comes to the question of the oil thing, if the United States were to be able to control the large reserves of oil in Venezuela and were to invest heavily on it, it will be a massive boost to the position of the empire. There's no question about it. After all, they're the largest reserve of oil in the world. They have third largest reserve of gas in the world. They have maybe the fourth or fifth largest reserves of gold in the world, and they have rare earths in large quantities as well, plus everything else. They have copper, iron, you name it, they have it. and it's quite a big place. You know, Venezuela is quite a large country, so will definitely be a boost. The question is how exactly they go about taking control over it, which they will need to totally override the current government, which is there, including domestic as well as international position, plus the resistance that is going to take place in Venezuela itself. Now the Latin Americans are beginning to realize how dangerous it is, but they have supported some of the right-wing governments are so taking a distance to it, including, you know, as we see in some people in the Caribbean. If they don't control it, which they don't seem they're going to be able to in the short term, unless the military go in there, which with a lot of problems, then the dollar will continue to decline as the world currency, because, you know, many countries realize how advantageous it is to actually not to have to depend on the dollar, which means you have to export something at, you know, at competitive prices internationally in order to get dollars for which you're going to buy manufactured goods, which are very expensive. So you lose. Basically, it's a lose-lose relationship. So that's going to continue. We'll see how it goes with dollar. I don't think Trump is going to be able to, without controlling substantial reserves of oil and, you know, natural resources everywhere. I don't think Trump is going to be able to actually improve the position of the empire, which is in very severe decline, because what is required to restore the United States, you know, as a sort of number one in the world from the economic point of view, is more than 10 to 20 trillion dollars. It's just too badly damaged.
Great. Thank you. We got two more questions up at the moment. We've got Roberta Kilkenny and Talal Karim. We'll take them in that order, and then you'll reply to two. Yes, Francisco. Roberta,
Okay.
you want to take the floor?
Yes, thank you very much. My question, Francisco, is what the impact may be within Venezuela of the dismissive statements made at Trump's press conference about the opposition. What is the possibility of the development of, let's say, a patriotic response within Venezuela among some of the less extreme opposition forces that may? I'm sorry, are you signaling to me, Luke?
Not you. No, sorry. A call came through.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there the
Okay.
possibility of developing a patriotic response to the U.S. threat to Venezuela, given how very obvious the dismissal of the opposition was during the press conference? Thank you.
Thanks for that. Talal.
Thank you very much, Luke. It was a very useful, informative meeting. What I wanted to ask, two things. One is the current government sort of acting interim by the vice president, no doubt, is still the legitimate government. So how could Trump say USA will rule Venezuela for the time being? Does he mean the area where all the oil fields, oil reserves are? So that is it a bit like the Iraq situation? Iraq was a bit more complicated, where they went in for Saddam because of oil and everything else. And then they appointed Paul Bremer, if you remember the interim, who then acknowledged many years later that it was a blunder. It was a mistake. And wherever they have done these military interventions, they have failed. No doubt it will fail here in Venezuela as well. And I'm sure there will be American casualties in Venezuela as well. Second thing is, what if Putin decides, with all the territory he has in control in Ukraine, if he were to kidnap Zelensky? Just imagine the reaction that will follow. Or if China invaded Taiwan and kidnapped the president of Taiwan. Just imagine the reaction to those events there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Talal. Okay, Francisco, you want to take those two?
Yeah, the impact already there are about 5 think it's about 5 opposition political parties inside Venezuela that field candidates, participate in elections, recognize the results, and collaborate with the government on patriotic questions. It's already going on. And in the last period, I remember seeing, in national television in Venezuela, that this section of the opposition were doing joint programs regarding the fleet, the US fleet and so on, joint programs on national television with Chavistas, which was, quite an interesting. Before there were some connections at the level of the National Assembly, but this became a sort of political united front. And many of them, they say that themselves, they joined the militias in order to fight against it. So that's already in place. Their polls from Venezuela itself indicate that Maria Corina Machado and her crowd are very unpopular in Venezuela. This is between 90 to 94%. And also the same amount actually opposes, the US war on them. I think the important point on this is the following. I think I made the point. Venezuela went through hell with the sanctions, and Maduro recovered the whole thing, and they became normal again. And now that the opposition, this extreme opposition, is calling for the United States to come in and brutalize them again, is something they cannot contemplate. Chavistas and non-Chavistas. So I think that's possible. And the government is going to encourage, that's the collaboration as much as possible. It has been doing it for a long time again. Regarding the more international question, I doubt that Putin is going to do something like that really much, because once you do that, then you become like like this mafioso in the United States, and then you legitimize whatever they do against you. And the points of attack that the United States has enormous. China has one military base outside China, one, which is in Chad, only one, with the request of the Chadians, particularly because the protection of one pipeline. The United States has 800 military bases in the world. So if you were to go for the same method, you can imagine what Trump is going to do. Okay, that's the way you want to play, which is the way he wants to play, because he wants no rules. He wants a system where they determine what happens by them imposing things, everywhere, which is why they're pulling away from the United Nations, from UNICEF, from everything they can, in order to ensure they have complete control. And I even doubt more that the Chinese are going to go for them. Xi Jinping made a statement welcoming the new year in 2026 on 31st of December, where he said, as far as he is concerned, as far as China is concerned, the unity with Taiwan is unstoppable, no matter what anybody does. But they're not going to actually go for a conflict, military conflict. And I forgot to talk about the question of the Sahel, which Stephen asked me. The Sahel requested, the 3 countries of the Sahel, the alliance now that exists, requested security from the Russians, and the Russians sent troops. And several of the military bases that were French were expelled from the military bases by the Sahelians, inviting the Russians to occupy them. And literally, as the Russians were moving in, the French were forced to go out in a rather humiliating manner. So they have taken all the decisions, and their view, the Sahel 3 countries, is one attack on one of them. An attack on one of them is an attack on all 3 of them. And they decided to not merge, but coalesce their military forces to defend themselves collectively against any attack. And clearly the attack on Nigeria has got to do with, a threat to the Sahel. We'll see how far Trump is prepared to go with this.
Yeah, thank you. We've got Simon Hines. Take the floor. Unmute.
Simon.
Hi. Firstly, thanks for the analysis. It was very, very useful, very good analysis. My question arises from comments from a former CIA analyst, Larry Johnson, who does a lot of commentary online. And what he suggested was that the seizure, or the future seizure of Venezuelan oil, was necessary in order to engage in a conflict with Iran. And that Netanyahu recently visited Trump, and the presumption is they talked about an attack on Iran. Now, the oil, Venezuelan oil, is necessary to replace the temporary loss of oil that would come about if Iran blocks the Suez Canal. So, do you think a war in Iran is likely as a result of the coup? Thanks.
Thanks.
Look,
Yeah,
John,
you can go, Francisco. There's not another question up there. Thanks.
yeah. I mean, this is a very difficult one. I know Larry, you know, he's quite a sound analyst and he knows a great deal. It's quite good to listen to him. On the question of Iran, it's difficult to know exactly how far the United States prepared to go. And the reason is, if Venezuela is a difficult one, from the point of view of military power, you know, development and, you know, people supporting, resisting, Iran is much worse from that point of view. Remember, all the wars that began in 2001, they had as key target, not the only target, but as a key target, Iran. And what they ended up doing was, you know, strengthening politically and in some ways also economically because of self-sufficiency that Iran had to go through in order to overcome and circumvent the sanctions. They ended up in strengthening quite dramatically. So a big player in the whole of the Middle East is Iran. And to attack it in the way they did was a sort of not very significant. And I'm not sure whether there is a connection between the two of them. How can you justify politically to your military establishment and to your, you know, political establishment in the United States? I need to attack Venezuela because I want to attack Iran. It's sort of, there's no quite kind of logic there. If he says we want to get rid of this undemocratic government because, you know, we want the oil, possibly he will get support. So I'm not sure what Larry Johnson knows that I don't. Not that I know too much about. Johnson knows much more than I do. I think it's a different one. Now, a final point on this I want to make is Trump seems to be opening too many fronts at the same time, which from this tactical and strategic point of view is not very wise. Because at one point, if one of them goes wrong, then, you know, the things begin to explode in your face. And what they're offering to the countries they've managed to control is so brutal, is so disgustingly brutal, that, you know, resistance is inevitable, such as in Ecuador, where there is a gangster regime which is brutalizing the population, assassinating them, and it's a narco state, really a narco state. If you want a narco state which is real, that's the one. And then they went for a referendum recently to actually get the population to support changed the constitution to allow the United States to have military bases in the Galapagos Islands, and they lost by more than 60%. So that's an indication, you know, how the United States is able to damage things, is able to control things temporarily, but what it introduces, what it implements, is so disgusting, is so terrible, is so unpopular that, you know, it produces very rapid reactions. The new government of Bolivia, to give an example of this, is in power for what, 3-4 weeks? And it's already have a general strike in their hands by the working class. That is a clear indication of how stupid and how right-wing they are, and the United States is the one that is encouraging this. So what they're able to win, they're not able to consolidate because of what they offer, which is very little. Pillage, brutality, and military bases, whereas other countries in the world offer you investment, credit, technology, and market. The difference is so clear. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Francisco. There's two, there are two questions. Corbina will put them to you in a minute. They're on the chat, which I haven't seen, and then we'll have Joseph. But before you do, you know, in terms of action and what can we do to resist this bully in the White House in the Caribbean? Can people start to organize, for instance, like, you know, boycotting American goods and so on, and organizations, you know, within the region and without? I mean, it should be a total boycott of the American stuff in the whole world, really. What do you think about a boycott in the working? How do you see that working?
You mean the boycott of?
So to boycott American goods. So do you think we should mount a campaign to call for boycott of?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of that for moral reasons. The number of people you are going to persuade not to consume McDonald's would be small. Will not damage the company. What we want to do is to persuade governments and people at that level of political influence that actually take action to oppose things that are being done by the United States, which particularly in Europe, the response is so weak. It's embarrassing. That's where I think we can play a very significant role. If we were able to sort of get Sir Keir to actually say, we don't, as he said at one point, during the crisis in Venezuela, he said, we had nothing to do with this. That is something we can build upon. But then he got the phone call, I imagine, from the White House saying, what do you think? What do you think you're talking about? And he changed his tune right away. He's in favor of transition. He never recognized the government of Maduro as legitimate, blah, 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 and all the rest of it. And he's under pressure for this. And but because they capitulate so embarrassingly, the Europeans, to the United States, why people like Keir Starmer has a rate of approval of 15% in the poll. So that's the clear indication. So we can't really hit them hard, but in order to hit them, we need MPs to join the MPs that already say that it needs to be condemned. The more we get, the easier it is. That's what trade unions and so on. Definitely, any boycott, by all means. I don't drink Coca-Cola, even though I love it. But I, got make the sacrifice not to drink Coca-Cola. So that helps.
Okay, try Morbi. It's a good drink. Kwabena, you want to come in with
Yes, very
before Joseph.
Okay, very quickly. Firstly, like many other people in the chat, I have refused to go to the Americas, even though my wife and myself had quite a lot of relatives there. So, Francisco, I'm doing my bit to boycott America as well. Now, two questions that were in the chat. One person, I haven't got their name, said Al Jazeera reported that Chevron pumps oil to the USA exclusively as it has waived sanctions. Are you able to answer that? And then secondly, Michael Boateng has asked, why did the pink tide of countries in the Southern Cone decline in 2020? In the 2020s?
Yeah. Look.
Yeah, please go. If you want to take those two or you want to
jump in. Well, the way the United States in the East Coast needs Venezuelan oil, which is very specific. It's a very type of, they call it bituminous, which is heavy and thick. So the Venezuela in the past, because of the pressure of the United States, invested in the United States itself refineries and many petrol stations, I think 6,000 to 12,000. There are different information about that. But, it was really servicing the East Coast of the United States. And they still need that, because if they were to change to a different oil, they have to invest in the refineries and everything, which would be too costly and they don't have money. So that's why the Biden administration decided to suspend the sanctions for US companies to actually go and purchase and get oil from Venezuela to the East Coast. And that's where Chevron comes in. And Maduro said, if somebody wants to buy my oil, I'll sell it. Why not? And he was prepared to offer good conditions so could attract more and so on, which, is what countries in this situation try to do to ensure that multinational companies come in to invest and bring money and resources and have to pay to get it. And it was suspended 6 times at a time because the sanction was not lifted, just the sanction was suspended. And that was the same with Trump, exactly the same. That's where that comes in. And then, the pink tide. Well, there was the credit crunch. The credit crunch made raw materials collapse, the price of raw materials. So imagine when it comes to Brazil, which was one of the biggest exporters at the time, particularly iron to China, huge amounts. Suddenly the market for that in China goes down dramatically because of the credit crunch. there's contraction of economic activity in every possible field. Certainly in China took place. And then not only Brazilians were selling less iron than before, but because there is a contraction on the demand, the price goes down as well. So it's a double whammy. And these apply to all of the raw materials in the region. All the countries went through tremendous difficulties, and many of them, I think all of them, almost no exception, actually could not sustain financially the social programs that were very expansive, very big, huge. And when they couldn't, they went into crisis. The opposition capitalized on this. The United States intervened, and it was able to get rid of several of them, including some military coup in Honduras in 2009, and certainly in Paraguay in 2012, and then prepared the ground to impeach Dilma Rousseff in 2016 because of the economic complications that decline as a result of the credit crunch had created. That's why it declined, but it hasn't gone away. It's still there, trying to survive.
Okay, thanks, Francisco. I think we got the two final questions, and Joseph, your hands was up first, and then Steve, the final question, I think.
Yes,
Joseph.
yeah,
Thanks.
two questions. Are you hearing me?
I do.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, Joseph.
Yeah.
Yeah, two questions. One has to do with the impact of a possible revitalization of Venezuela's oil and maybe even Trinidad and maybe Grenada. What that has for the climate, what impact are you seeing in terms of the fierce hurricanes that we're having? So that's a basic question. The other one has to do with how do you see the fallout from the position of the Trinidad government affecting CARICOM going forward, if they just settle one way or the other? Thank you.
Steve?
Done?
Okay, go on. Take that one then, Francisco. Then we go to Steve.
Yeah, it's difficult. What you're suggesting might happen, should happen before we can do it. If there was an agreement between these two countries, which are, oil producers, that would be fantastic. It depends on the agreement, if it happens. If countries begin to leave the CARICOM or become independent, they become extremely vulnerable. So I think, most people in those countries will say this is not a good idea to actually go that way, because there is strength in numbers. Therefore, I think that's my answer.
Okay, Steve, you want to put a question?
Not so much a question as
Yeah.
people have put in the chat that they wanted to know about some of the things at least we can do in London. Well, here are the details of an online rally this evening and a picket outside Downing Street tomorrow at 6 p.m. So the least we can do, it seems to me, is try and assist with these things. So there are the details on the screen, and the links have been put in the chat. And I think, I think it's right there should be a picket outside Downing Street, because the disgraceful statement that Keir Starmer made today, that he respected international law, but he wanted to, it was just complete rubbish. So I think that's where the pressure needs to be at the minute. But so there you go.
Thank you. Okay, I think that leaves just time for us to wrap up. And can I see you, Francisco? Are you around there? Just to thank you for
I hope I answered all the questions. There were plenty. Delighted to engage with you people. You always ask difficult questions, and I have to do acrobatics to answer them properly. So thank you so much for that, for making my life difficult.
It's always